Do you think India's current doctrine requires a rethink, or is it good for now?
Were you to ask me, in my view, whether our doctrine of no first use is a valid doctrine today, my answer would be yes.
Since its first nuclear test in 1974, India has maintained a unique position on nuclear weapons and international law. While vocally committed to nuclear disarmament and a rules based international order, India still remains outside the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, commonly called the NPT. Instead, it has pursued a stance by which it has subscribed to the no first use doctrine. It has sought legitimacy not through treaty alignment but through responsible stewardship. This has enabled India to engage with these norms in the nuclear industry while also shaping them. The culmination of this was, of course, with the 2008 Indo US Civil Nuclear Agreement and subsequent waivers from the nuclear suppliers group, despite not being a signatory to the NPT. In this action, India saw a clear shift from being outside the nuclear hierarchy to being a prominent voice within it. The nation's nuclear stance reflects its broader evolution from a norm taker in international law to a potential norm shaper. But conflicts over the years, from Kargil to Balakot to Sindoor now, have raised some questions about India's 20-year-old nuclear doctrine. Can a country that stands outside the global non-proliferation regime still play a significant role in it? Does India's geopolitical environment, marked by Chinese assertiveness and Pakistani instability, support long term restraint? And how is the restatement of the now recently announced new doctrine of war? What impact does that have on nuclear? To discuss these issues, I am delighted that we have with us today a very eminent guest, Ambassador Rakesh Sood. Ambassador Sood is a seasoned Indian diplomat with over 40 years of experience in foreign affairs, economic diplomacy, and international security. He has served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France, and was the country's first permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. As the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Disarmament and Nuclear Non-Proliferation, he played a pivotal role in shaping India's strategic nuclear policies. Currently, Ambassador Sood serves as a distinguished fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, an independent New Delhi-based think tank providing strategic analysis and policy recommendations to governments, businesses, and institutions. Welcome to Justify, Ambassador Sood. So let's jump straight in. So India's 2003 nuclear doctrine emphasizes credible minimum deterrence and a no first use policy. Given Operation Sindoor in the aftermath of Pahalgam and doctrines like Pakistan's refusal to adopt a no first use policy and China's constant expansion of its own capabilities, do you think India's current doctrine requires a rethink, or is it good for now?
I personally think we can address the question in two ways, Arghya. I think that the nuclear doctrine should be uh, kept under review. A review should be undertaken periodically, and I don't want to judge the outcome of a review. However, were you to ask me, in my view, whether our doctrine of no first use is a valid doctrine today, my answer would be yes. And I'll explain that why I say this. The reason is that I think you said in your introduction that India has a unique position in the nuclear order. I, I fully endorse that. I think we are a sui generis country in the nuclear order because we are the only country which began our nuclear program as a peaceful program and very reluctantly, as it were, went towards the military security weapon side. Even after 1974, we waited a quarter century before we came out as a nuclear weapons state. It was 1998 when we did the tests, and then we change that approach. There is no other country. Every other country that you can think of, whether it is the United States, Soviet Union, China, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, every other country went down the nuclear road as a military program. And so this sets us aside. That's point one. Second point is that from the time that nuclear weapons first emerged in 1945, there were two conflicting emotions that the scientists grappled with. And I think the whole world, now that people have seen Oppenheimer, are more familiar with the kind of dilemmas that the scientific community at that time also faced. One was an immense sense of achievement in terms of unlocking the mysteries of nature. And the second was a sense of horror at having produced a weapon that was by far the most destructive weapon which would destroy all of humanity. So these two sentiments kind of created a kind of a conflict, and we've seen examples of that in the scientific community. Some of the scientists who worked on it became pacifists and so on, and all the rest of it. Now, in India, because we were a reluctant nuclear weapon state, we always saw nuclear weapons not as weapons of war fighting, but as weapons for deterrence. And that meant that we did not look at it as something where that creates a difficulty for the military people. I mean, how do you tell a military general, any guy in uniform, that here is a weapon, but you can use it to deter your adversary, but you can't use it actually. You should not use it as a it's not meant to be used as a weapon of war. Now, it creates a dilemma in the mind of any military general. And that is why the way we have reconciled it, and other countries too, is the no first use doctrine. And the third point that I will make is that why it makes sense for us, not just from a moral standpoint, but also from a purely realist standpoint, is that we actually do not perceive an existential threat to India. I don't think that the Chinese want to come and occupy New Delhi. I don't think that the Chinese think that we are going to go and occupy Beijing. I don't think that the Pakistanis are going to come and occupy Red Fort in New Delhi. Now, the Pakistanis may think that we want to destroy their country, but that is their thinking. But what I'm trying to say is that therefore, we don't perceive an existential threat. And if we don't perceive an existential threat, then I see little reason from a purely realist perspective to shift away from a no first use. Because remember, it is not just a question of taking out one word and saying, oh, no first use becomes first use. There is a whole lot of technical, strategic, and organizational shifts that have to accompany a first use. It means you have to reconfigure your arsenal. It means your command and control has to get restructured. It means that there has to be a certain delegation of authority, because if you are going to have small low yield or tactical nuclear weapons going all the way to strategic nuclear weapons, then you need to have different levels of authority which would be involved.
Absolutely.
And you get into a war fighting doctrine. So
Absolutely.
given this, I still think that we are on very safe and very secure ground with the no first use doctrine. At the same time, I do not know what the scientific and technological developments with regard to nuclear weapons may possibly be tomorrow. And so therefore, I would still say that please keep it under review, perhaps every 10 years or something like that.
Right. I think that's a very balanced perspective. But if I were to take that third point that you made, that of course India doesn't perceive an existential threat. And if existential threat is defined as occupation of Delhi by either the Chinese or the Pakistanis, sure, I can fully agree with you. It doesn't seem that that kind of existential threat is upon us, at least at this point of time. But does the fact that Pakistan doesn't have a no first use policy, does that fact not worry you?
No. Now, Pakistan is a strange country. I think Voltaire said this about Prussia for the first time, sometime uh, in the middle 18th century, when he said that states have armies, but in the case of Prussia, it is the army that has a state of Prussia.
Right.
And I think this also applies to a great extent to Pakistan, and it has that example has been that parallel has been drawn. The fact that the Pakistan military needs to project India as a consistent, permanent threat is what enables the Pakistan military to keep its hold on domestic politics. That is a peculiar internal problem for Pakistan to resolve. Otherwise, I do not think, frankly, that Pakistan need look at India as an existential threat.
Hmm. So the fact that you think that the Pakistan and the Pakistani state not adopting a no first use policy is posturing, and we should be able to see beyond that.
I wouldn't say it is posturing, because after all, they have developed, and if you see their doctrine, they have developed tactical nuclear weapons. They claim they have tactical nuclear weapons. And at the same time, uh, Pakistan also has a doctrine called full spectrum deterrence. Now, uh, obviously, it doesn't make sense, because what Pakistan is saying is that its nuclear weapons are supposed to protect it from all kinds of threats.
Hmm.
Whereas our doctrine is very simple. It is supposed to deter threat of nuclear use and nuclear use against India, and of course, other weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons. But let's keep that aside for a minute, and let's just focus on the nuclear dimension, which is why a lot of people uh, asked the government, asked Prime Minister Vajpayee at that time, uh, see, Kargil happened. Your nuclear weapons didn't protect you. The fact is that nuclear weapons were not intended to be a defense against Kargil. It
That's
was
right.
never intended as such. Or even for that matter, Mumbai. Nuclear weapons could not have defended you against the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. Similarly, today, when we talk of hybrid warfare and non-attributable offensive cyber capabilities being used, how are nuclear weapons going to be a defense against that? So I think the Pakistani doctrine of full spectrum deterrence is more for domestic consumption in Pakistan than actually a serious doctrine. It can be questioned
Right.
on these grounds.
Right. No, this is actually a very interesting point that you make, that obviously traditional warfare has shifted. Uh, I mean, significantly shifted, and especially if we see Operation Sindoor, it's anything but traditional warfare. No for boots on the ground, no one even crossing into anyone else's territory. But still, what we would call the closest that India and Pakistan have been to a full-scale war. So, do you think that in this new age of hybrid warfare, uh, non-state actors, and in this age of insurgencies and counter-terror attacks, uh, do you think that the role of the nuclear deterrent has much significance, or do you think that we need to think about these things in a different framework?
Well, I think the Operation Sindoor showed a certain degree of restraint. In fact, if we look at Balakot, if we look at um, the Uri strategic uh, our
Surgical
surgical
strike.
strikes uh, in 2016, there is a gradual shift to developing a capability for kinetic retaliation. Now, in 2008, after Mumbai, which was a horrific attack, there was a degree of criticism that India did not punish Pakistan. But the fact is that I don't think we had those capabilities. When did we start getting the Rafale aircraft? 2019-20. When did we start getting these standoff weapons? Around the same time. When did we start getting drones? Around the same time. When did the Indian Air Force order its domestic, the kamikaze drones? Was 2021. So when did we start getting our air defense, the S-400s? Again, after 2019. And we still haven't got all the 5 units that we had paid for. We've only got 3 at the moment. So I think these capabilities have taken time to develop and for the forces to get used to a kind of a contactless, because you're not engaging in direct contact, because even our Air Force, and for that matter, the Pakistani Air Force, did not cross the line of control or the international boundary. They also use standoff weapons. They use their air defense. We used our air defense to neutralize incoming drones or incoming missiles and so on. But perhaps second time when we look at it, we may decide we can do this using offensive cyber capabilities or things like that. So these tactics will also evolve over a period of time. You could also neutralize certain capabilities by breaking into algorithms and sending out confusing messages, instructions to their aircraft or spoofing them,
That's right.
which would be, by the time you have completed it, you would have neutralized the hostile air defense environment and you would have completed your operation.
That's right. That's right. And I think that we are in this kind of brave new world, which is becoming increasingly and increasingly unfamiliar in some ways. And so it's obviously even more critical that we get up to speed. And as a lawyer, it seems that law is having a hard time getting up to speed with developments in technology. I think anyway with international law, it already started on the back foot, given the fact that international law has always had a question mark at the end of it, unlike other areas of law, with many questioning as to whether it actually has any legal binding value. So I wanted to ask you, you've been maybe broaden the horizon a little bit. You've been a diplomat for 4 decades. You've, of course, focused on issues of disarmament and nuclear, but several others as well. In your view, what role has international law played in questions around war? And in the last 20 years, I don't want to go back to the Second World War and the First World War, but what role has international law played or not played in stopping or in impacting war? And what do you think it has any role in this new age of warfare?
Well, if you look at the evolution of laws of war in the international legal domain, I think it has a fairly long history.
That's right.
And in a sense, it got crystallized with the Geneva Conventions in 1949. So you can say that it got consolidated, as it were, post-World War II. And there are certain basic principles that exist, namely that, there has to be your right to retaliation has to be proportionate. It cannot be extreme. Second, you have to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants.
Sorry, if I may just interrupt you. That is why, as a lawyer, I was particularly gratified the number of times the Foreign Secretary used the word necessary and proportionate. It
Yes.
seemed that he was very well advised.
Yes.
Hmm.
So then you have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. So if you notice, the Foreign Secretary also said we wanted to avoid civilian casualty, collateral damage to be avoided. And the third thing is that your weapons must be such that they avoid unnecessary suffering. You know, one of the first things that was uh, people got out of dum-dum bullets and things like that, you know, stuff like that. Now, these principles have by and large stayed intact. Gradually, but then suddenly other things started happening. People found that it wasn't just states that were fighting. So it wasn't armed conflict among states, but even non-state actors, as it were. So these were made applicable, although how you implement the applicability becomes obviously a question, has a question mark. But then when it came to nuclear weapons, nobody wanted to touch it. And so you have the 1996 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which, frankly, in my personal opinion, with all due respect to the learned judges that constituted the bench, leaves a lot to be desired because nuclear weapons do not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. They do cause unnecessary suffering. We've seen that. I mean, the long-lasting effects of radiation is unnecessary suffering. And they are certainly not proportionate. I mean, you know, you can say they are proportionate if somebody has used a nuclear weapon
Already.
against already. So, which means that you're looking at retaliatory use of nuclear weapons. But in a first use of nuclear weapons, it would not pass the test of proportionality. So, therefore, in a sense, to me, that is a further justification for no first use.
That's right. That's right.
But to come back, when we look at capabilities like offensive cyber capabilities, which are designed to be non-attributable to begin with, how does international law or laws of war, how do you apply that? And today, laws of war in the application has become so different with terms of sanctions and media wars and things like that. So it becomes difficult to see how laws of war are going to apply in today's days of uh, hybrid warfare as it is.
So this reminds me that India has of course championed this comprehensive convention against international terrorism for at least the last 3 decades, and we've been calling. Of course, it has kind of subsided a little bit. I don't hear much of it in the last few years, but there was certainly a lot of talk of it when it was initially made, and then again when Prime Minister Modi took over. So, do you think that that is a serious effort that India should consider a global convention against terrorism to deal with this question of non-state actors, particularly?
Look, between we've been a victim of terrorism. I think what has happened is in the 1990s, there was much less of an understanding in the international community about what global terrorism was. I mean, if you remember, in 1996 was when Al Qaeda was officially created
That's right.
by Osama bin Laden. And I remember in my conversations with the Americans when we used to talk about this and explain to them, we've engaged with the Americans on some of these issues from the early 1990s itself. I mean, there would be they would listen to us, but they would not be as receptive, shall I say. The world changed with 9/11. In 2001, suddenly things changed dramatically. And I think the world saw the impact that global terrorism could have. And that is when we also highlighted the fact that global terrorism, if they could get their hands on weapons of mass destruction, I mean, that would be absolutely disastrous. And so people started tightening up all kinds of export controls and chemicals on biological agents and all kinds of things. So the point I'm making is that now there is even perhaps a grudging acceptance, uh, depending on your political relationship with these countries, of India's right to retaliation,
Right.
military retaliation. So when we say that we have to go to the root of this problem and take out those terrorists and target those terrorists, there is an understanding and there is an appreciation at the same time that what we are doing is, as the Foreign Secretary said, proportionate, responsible, and non-escalatory. However, there are two things here. You've got, unlike, let's say, Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah, here you've got two states that both of which have nuclear weapons.
That's right.
And we also know that Pakistan has a military dominated polity, a military dominated political structure. It's quite clear. Areas of Pakistan's foreign policy and security policy are the sole preserve of the Pakistan military and has been so and is the case today. So when it comes to a toss-up between for the international community to support India in terms of its right to react militarily to terrorist attack, and coupled with that, um, a growing tension between two nuclear weapon states where one of them resorts to nuclear saber rattling from time to time. I mean, obviously, it is the latter that grabs attention in the international media. And that's almost natural. And so then what happens is that the international focus shifts more towards urging both sides to take steps to de-escalate. And in that, that blurs or obfuscates the distinction between the perpetrator of the terrorist attack
Yeah,
and the victim of the terrorist attack.
absolutely.
Whereas if you could, what we try to do is to keep the focus on the victim and the perpetrator. So it is, therefore, the focus is on being able to undertake a degree of kinetic retaliation. Now we
That's
can come to that. Do we achieve deterrence by that?
right.
Do we manage escalation? Do we need external involvement for de-escalation? I mean, these are some of the other questions that arise from the
That's right.
pattern that we have seen.
That's right. And in fact, that segues quite nicely because I think a lot of this is happening in a legal void. No one is talking about ever taking any, I mean, complaining about Pakistani action to the ICJ or any kind of internationalization or legalization of this conflict. There has not been a single article of this kind that I have read, and that's of course fertile ground, as you rightly said, for blurring of these lines, as in between who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, and also international involvement in supposed international involvement in de-escalation. So I wanted to ask you, as kind of we're heading to the last segment of our discussion, that of course the role of the United States in this entire matter of de-escalation has been questioned. Uh, but I don't want to get into the factual aspects because we don't know what factually transpired, and I don't want this to be another speculatory exercise. But I wanted to ask you about the role of dialogue and kinetic responses in de-escalation. Now, the two things are different, as we've seen. If the ultimate aim is deterrence, as in you've seen that we follow two very different approaches, one with the kinetic responses like in Uri, Balakot, and now in Sindoor, and post 2611, where we said dialogue first. I mean, broadly speaking, no kinetic response, and then ultimately follow up with some amount of dialogue. So the question that I wanted to ask you is that do you think that what do you think rather is the role of dialogue in both de-escalation, lengthening of the nuclear fuse, and if so, do you see the role of third-party actors, in which, in this case, other sovereign states, in facilitating such a dialogue?
Well, one, we, I think it would be good if we could find the route to de-escalation between the two of us. But for that, you need to have established channels of communication. You need to have a practice of crisis management. Now, as has been said, the only channel of communication that is currently operational between the two countries and has been the case for some time is the DGMO's hotline.
That's right.
Between the Director Generals of military operations on both sides. Now, that is not necessarily, I mean, if you have one channel of communication, then obviously that is not what is going to lead to crisis management, crisis resolution, etc., etc. In which case, external actors will come in. But if you are serious about being able to manage it yourself, then you need to have multiple such channels. You need to be able to develop this capability. So, but under the circumstances, if we don't have it, then obviously it will be external actors who will come in and urge de-escalation. I mean, if you recall in the case of Balakot, what happened was that we had an unforeseen development. The unforeseen development was that in the dogfight that took place between the two air forces, there was an Indian pilot. An Indian plane got shot down, and the Indian pilot, when he ejected, instead of landing on the Indian side, the winds carried him and he landed on the Pakistani side. And so the issue of one Indian pilot in Pakistani custody overshadowed everything else.
Correct.
The second thing is that any de-escalation requires a face saver for both sides. It is quite clear that both sides will have their own narrative. If India has declared that we have successfully completed Operation Sindoor or phase one of Operation Sindoor because we have only put it on pause, as the Prime Minister says. So phase one is complete. But Pakistan, if you look at Pakistan, Pakistan claims victory. Pakistan says that they have they have demonstrated their air superiority, they have demonstrated their capability, they've demonstrated their will, etc., etc. And there is a recent Gallup Pakistan poll that was done, and it said that 96% of the Pakistani population believe that they have been victorious in this 4-day conflict. And you saw General Asif Munir being elevated to field marshal. But fine. What I'm saying is that de-escalation requires both sides to get a face saver. So first of all, we must accept this. And Pakistan too. Now, if you go back to Balakot, our narrative was that we had struck deep inside at Balakot, which was in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It was a terrorist camp. Hundreds of terrorists had been killed. Pakistan said that they had retaliated. First, they denied that anybody had been killed. Then they said that, well, we retaliated. We showed our will and our resolve and our humanitarian concern. We shot down their plane. We had a captive Indian pilot, but out of the goodness of our heart, we returned.
Oh.
So, I mean, they got away. In the case of the surgical strikes, we said we had undertaken this coordinated surgical strikes across various launch pads and so on. Pakistan says nobody came. So both sides had a way out of it. Since they said nobody came, no external involvement became relevant. It wasn't needed because they just denied it. But we claimed, there's even a movie about it, as you know, a very successful film that was made of Uri. So any de-escalation, we need to understand, would require a face saver on both sides. Now, if we have to manage the de-escalation ourselves, that means that we must always have that option visibly open for the other side.
Absolutely. And I think the fact is that the earlier point that you also made, I think, is a very critical one, that for any successful de-escalation, there needs to be open channels of communication. And it was quite clear, apart from the actual fact that it was only the DGMOs who were speaking to each other. It was quite curious that the names that we gave to our operations respectively, Sindoor on this side and Bunyal al Marsus, which is
Mm.
a solid wall of lead. It seems like we were not only literally talking in different languages, but also figuratively, we were in two different planes.
We
So
were
I think
both
that there is
appealing
a
to domestic. We were both appealing to domestic constituencies in the labeling that we were taking recourse to.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that that does leave us with these questions in terms of, given the fact that Prime Minister Modi has said that this is only a pause, uh, where do we head next? And in your view, last word to you, do you see any resumption of conflict anytime in the near future?
Uh, my worry is one that you can always have a terrorist group, let's say, which would like to provoke something, because I think it is clear that terrorist groups are not under the full control, command, discipline of an army. They often act as with a degree as independent agents as well, and their interests are different. Armies tend to look at cost benefit analysis. Terrorist groups often don't. Otherwise, you won't have suicide attacks. If the same cost benefit analysis could be applied to a terrorist group's calculations, then where would you see suicide attacks? And therefore, you could have a situation where, say, a terrorist group does something, and because we don't have channels deliberately to provoke a conflict or to aggravate a conflict. And because you don't have adequate channels of communication, something gets sparked off inadvertently. Now, that is another reason why you would need or you should have channels of communication and develop a habit of crisis management together, which is, I think, necessary. However, if we discount this for the moment, I would say I do not think that the Pakistan military is going to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure that they've built up, like Lashkar-e-Toiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed or a dozen plus other terrorist groups that they have nurtured over decades. They're not going to dismantle that. It's very much a part of their policy. Pakistan military does not want to fight a full-fledged ground war. What are they going to achieve? You can't. So this is their now tried and tested policy. They're habituated to it. And so sooner or later, uh, I mean, if surgical strikes got you 3 years and Balakot got you 5 years, uh, you know, you can say that Parliament attack and the Op Parakram got you 7 years, or that was. But all of these things take place in certain geopolitical contexts, like Op Parakram happened at the time when the US needed Pakistani support. This is 2001.
Correct.
They were in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani said, look, if the Indians are going to be deployed at our border, we can't spare any people to go to the Afghan border. And so there was a mutual interest, and there were assurances given, and the LOC became quiet and peaceful and remained like that for a number of years. And again, but you also have to understand that between 2008 and 2022, I think Pakistan has been on the Financial Action Task Force grey list 3 times for
That's
a
right.
period of 9 years out of those 18. But it
That's
has
right.
never been on the blacklist.
That's right. So we'll leave it there, Ambassador Sood. The future, as you said, is unpredictable, and we can only hope that nothing inadvertent sparks off another round of hostilities. And we hope that this will have bought both the Pakistani military some time and added relevance, as it has for its general, now Field Marshal, And as far as India is also concerned, this victory will also be seen by domestic constituents as certainly a shot in the arm of a powerful government that this time is in a coalition, but has shown that it is as powerful as any other. So, hoping for peace, I want to thank you for this for this tour de force. And we've spanned a number of areas. So, thank you very much for your time. And on behalf of everybody who listens to Justify, we hope to have you again on the show soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Arghya.